Welcome everybody to this event by the Access to Medicines Foundation, looking at the sustainable access for existing antibiotics focused on market challenges. I'm Anthony MacDonald. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Centre for Global Development, and where I lead our work on antimicrobial resistance. And I have an esteemed panel with me who I'll introduce shortly. But first of all, what are antibiotics? They are drugs that came from the 1940s and 50s originally that transformed modern medicine, often seen originally as miracle cures that could treat bacterial infections once seen as quickly fatal. They transformed modern medicine, underpinning many crucial services like cancer care and surgeries, transplants, where the risks of infection would be too dangerous in a world where we could not quickly treat bacteria. But as time has gone on, bacteria have evolved to evade the antibiotics we use to treat them in a process known as antibiotic resistance. Now, this is a problem because we end up losing that care that we need. And as we use first-line antibiotics, it becomes really important that people have access to the second and third-line treatments. A study done by the Access to Medicines Foundation found that only 14% of recent drugs were registered in more than 10 of 102 low and middle-income countries. And they report the lack of access to medicine is a major driver of drug resistance and how pharma can take access, that I recommend you taking a look at. Purely for moral reasons, I personally believe that the case is unanswerable for not making sure that these drugs are available to everybody who needs them. Nobody should die for want of an antibiotic. But also for self-interested reasons, high-income countries should take the lack of access much more seriously. Because when a person has a bacterial infection that is resistant to an antibiotic, a first-line antibiotic, and if they don't have access to a second or third-line antibiotic, then that resistance has a large selective advantage and is able to spread more widely through society, and they will eventually spread across the world. And as we lose access or frontline antibiotics, second and third line antibiotics have to come in and our stock of antibiotics is depleted. Now, antibiotic resistance is a huge problem everywhere in the world, but particularly in poorer parts where there tends to be less good sanitation and hygiene. People have less immediate access to medical facilities and so supportive care, and temperatures are often higher, and so bacterial resistance spreads more easily. A report out earlier this year estimated that 1.25 million people die directly of antimicrobial resistance, and almost 5 million people across the world die where resistance is a contributor to their death. And this is a problem everywhere. But young people in low and middle income countries face a much higher burden than older people, than they do in high income countries. So you're 58 times more likely to die in your first 5 years of life if you're born in a lower middle income country, born in sub-Saharan Africa, than if you're born in a high income country. And often it's that the first line treatments fail for these young kids, often in their first days of life, and they do not get the access to antibiotics that can treat that. So it is really important that we do more to improve that access to these drugs, which is why I'm a big proponent of the Access to Medicines Foundation's work, and so excited about today's event. And a report out today looks at how the lack of access to antibiotics and antifungals compromises cancer care in low and middle income countries. And I really recommend you take a look at this work, and I'm excited to hear Fatima talk about it. It's available on the Access to Medicines Foundation's website for free. Now, I'd like to introduce our wonderful panel. With me today, we've got Fatima Rafiki, Research Program Manager for the Antimicrobial Resistance Benchmark at the Access to Medicines Foundation. Benedict David Hutter, Research Team Lead at the Essential Medicines List at the World Health Organization. Jadip Gofte, Chief Medical Officer at CIPLA. And Jennifer Cohn, Director of Global Access at the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. I'm going to introduce the panelists in turn with a question. And if you have any questions yourself, please do send them in, as we would like people to write in the chat box, and we will be taking your questions as part of the discussion. So first, Fatima, the latest research from the Access to Medicines Foundation on how a lack of access drives antimicrobial resistance and what companies and other stakeholders can do to improve access appropriately. What is the current state of play, and how does the lack of access further impact other illnesses like cancer care in low and middle income countries?
Thank you, Anthony, and good afternoon to everyone who's joined. I'm excited to participate in this platform during World Antibiotic Awareness Week with the esteemed panel to discuss this very vital issue. So to start, it goes without saying that it's absolutely critical that every patient has access to the right medicine at the right time, no matter where they live in the world. And it's when the wrong antibiotic is prescribed that only some susceptible pathogens are killed, and pathogens with resistant genes can survive and spread unchecked. Pathogens know no borders, and drug-resistant infections spread globally. The lack of access to these essential medicines is a critical issue in low and middle income countries. These regions, namely Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where people are facing the highest risk of dying from drug-resistant infections, are the exact regions where many of those first and second line treatments that should be readily available for infections are not registered and cannot be sold or distributed to those that need them. And the implications of access to these medicines go beyond treating common infections. Infection is the second leading cause of death in patients with cancer, and it's estimated that nearly 60% of deaths of cancer patients are due to infection or infection-related. So the rise of AMR, coupled with the lack of access to the right antibiotics to prevent and treat these secondary infections in patients, is also compromising cancer treatments. So LMICs, also limited in their capacity to provide cancer care, carry the largest burden for cancer global mortality and account for 70% of the deaths due to cancer worldwide. So at the Foundation, we assess the pharmaceutical industry on their core responsibilities in developing new treatments, as well as making new and existing medicines and vaccines responsibly available to those that need them. Our analysis provides information on the current state of play and highlights where more needs to be done and by whom. The current state of play is challenging and uncertain, and especially for off-patent and generic, the off-patent and generic market in low and middle income countries. In November of 2021, we published the AMR benchmark report, and of the 17 companies that we assessed, we found that despite the many strategies that companies could use to make essential medicines available in low and middle income countries, only a third of the products that we analyzed had an access plan in place. To give it an exact number, of the 131 off-patent and generic medicines we analyzed, only 34 medicines had a plan in place to make them available in LMICs. So again, only 34 out of 131 off-patent and generic medicines had a plan in place to make them available. Some of the challenges that were reported include lack of insight into demand, leading to a lack of insight into market opportunities, low margins for older medicines, small patient numbers for newer medicines, registration procedures that require companies to gather and submit different data sets for each country that they want to introduce their products into, a fragile and fragmented antibiotic supply chain. So following the publication of the 2021 benchmark report, we took time to conduct a deeper dive into this particular finding and to understand the landscape of what's available versus what is being done. And by June of 2022, we were only able to identify a limited number of examples of ways that companies and their partners were using access strategies to make antibiotics and antifungals available in low and middle income countries. From our study, it was apparent that collaboration was the key ingredient. So we included a toolkit for access strategies, which include registration, patient access programs, policies to ensure equitable pricing, also opportunities to increase local availability through technology transfers to qualified regional and local manufacturers. The report also provides an appendix where we define each of the access strategies and provide an example of its implementation by a company when available. So it's important for companies to work together with stakeholders such as governments and procurement agencies, as well as local healthcare professionals, to collect and share data on demand, create conditions to ensure a sustainable market for novel products, and to streamline registration procedures for generic products. So for example, with an existing infrastructure and reliable local partners, it's possible for pharmaceutical companies to build local manufacturing capacity for much needed access to antibiotics. And this was demonstrated in the case study where Sanofi responded to a local demand and set up local production of metronidazole, a first-line access antibiotic, to treat gastrointestinal infections in Nigeria via capacity building and technology transfer. And as a result of that partnership, nearly 500,000 boxes of metronidazole are now annually produced for the Nigerian population. So despite the limited findings, the silver lining here is that a full toolkit and strategies are available, partnerships are being formed, and using the lessons learned, more companies and partners can follow this lead to provide access to these critical medicines. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really useful answer. And I am looking forward to digging down into some of those problems more deeply later. But first, Benedict, could you tell us about the essential medicines list and the AWARE classification? How should these be implemented in practice? And are there essential drugs that are not reaching the people who need them?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon from Geneva, everybody. Though when we talk about access to antibiotics, we obviously should not forget, especially during World Antimicrobial Awareness Week, that there's also a lot of overuse of antibiotics, right? We have the challenge that on the one hand, we have people that do not access antibiotics that need them. On the other hand, we have overuse of antibiotics that may not be indicated. The essential medicines list is published every 2 years by WHO since 1977. It contains about 480 medicines in its latest edition, and about 40 of those are antibiotics. And these antibiotics have been classified in 2017 into 3 categories. That make up the AWARE framework. AWARE, that's an abbreviation for Access, Watch, and Reserve. Access antibiotics are those that have the least potential for resistance, are the safest and most effective options for many infections. So classic examples would be amoxicillin or penicillin. Then there's a group of watch antibiotics that have a slightly higher potential for resistance, may have indications as first and second choices in very selected situations, but should be used with a lot of care. And we know that overuse of watch antibiotics, unfortunately, is common in many settings, so a key target for antibiotic stewardship activities. And then there's a reserve antibiotics that are last resort options for treatment of multi-drug resistant organisms. So a key example of a reserve antibiotic would be colistin or some of the newer agents like ceftazidime, avibactam. So initially, only antibiotics on the essential medicines list were classified in these categories, but this has been expanded. So all antibiotics, more or less, that are available are classified in these categories. There's actually a 4th category of not recommended antibiotics. These are antibiotic combinations that are overused in some countries and have no clear medical indication. Regarding access, now the key issue is here is an antibiotic on the essential medicines list, because all antibiotics of all classes, access, watch, and reserve, should be available at all times at the appropriate quality and should be affordable for everybody in all health systems. But there are over 200 other antibiotics where the role is maybe a little less clear. So when we talk about lack to access to antibiotics, I think there are 2 things to underline. One is the lack of access to the reserve antibiotics, so the antibiotics that are needed to effectively treat the most resistant infections. Typically, an example would be carbapenem-resistant Klebsiella or E. coli infections. These are infections are much more prevalent in some of the low middle income countries than in high income countries, but access is limited because even though they are cheaper than some of the other new medicines, if we think about cancer medicines that sometimes cost over $100,000 per year, but still compared to other antibiotics, they are very expensive and not affordable. I think we need to also take into account that this is not just an issue of having the medicine available, because we know that if they become available and they're not used appropriately, at some point they will also become less effective because of resistance. And here we have the problem also of lack of access to diagnostics. Many settings, microbiology labs are not available and they're not affordable for patients. So it's something that needs to be resolved together with access to medicines, access to appropriate diagnostics needs to be there. But it's not only the last resort antibiotics, it's also the access antibiotics sometimes where we know that there's a lack of sufficient accessibility. WHO has an official target in its 13th program of work of overall antibiotic use being at least 60% from the access group. Despite the fact that this is quite a conservative target because most infections encountered in the primary healthcare, and that's a majority of antibiotic use, can either be treated with no antibiotics or with access antibiotics. Many countries do not meet this target. And one reason, for example, is that it may that certain access antibiotics like amoxicillin may not be available because there may be financial incentive to rather provide watch antibiotics that then propagate resistance. So it's a complicated issue where we have both lack of access to the more narrow spectrum antibiotics that should be first line and lack of access to the newer last resort antibiotics. There is a clear overuse of watch antibiotics, and that should probably be one of the key priorities in many settings if you want to curb antimicrobial resistance worldwide. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much for that, Benedict. Can I remind people, if you have questions for any of our panelists, please do put them in the chat box and we will come to them in the discussion section. But before that, I'd like to ask Jaideep, how does CIPLA approach the rollout of antibiotics in low and middle income countries? How do you determine success, and what are the challenges, and are there lessons learned for other companies that you can share?
So thank you very much. And first, thank you for the kind invitation to participate in this. I think this is a very important week, which needs highlighting all the time, because as I think earlier pointed out by Benedict, this is a unique condition in which we have both the same problem is caused by lack of access and excess. Both are reaching the same endpoint of AMR, which is probably unheard of in any other therapeutic area. But coming back to your question, Anthony, is that as a company, the way CIPLA approaches the use of antimicrobials or the introduction and development of antimicrobials is really to look at first and foremost in the given country, and I can speak more from India point of view where I have the largest experience, is really to see what's the kind of data that is available on the resistance pattern in that country. On any particular area, you actually start with understanding what is the disease burden. And I can only give an example of several years ago when CIPLA introduced colistin, an antibiotic which was given up in the 1940s or 50s, but had resurfaced in some parts of the world to be used. And it wasn't available in India. And it was only at an infectious disease meeting in one of the hospitals in Mumbai that we were informed that we have a lot of patients now coming into the hospital or developing infections in the hospital, which deems to be treated with meropenem, because they were becoming resistant to penims and most of the beta-lactams. So therefore, they were importing privately colistin from the UK. And I was quite taken aback. And that really set us thinking. I do recall we did a quick survey, found that there was only one supplier of the API at that time globally. We managed to get that API. It took us about a year to get approval into India, passing through the various registration processes. At that time, we were fortunate that a waiver was granted for a formal final clinical trial because it was an old drug which had been approved in the 40s and 50s. The unmet need was recognized by the experts, and a limited permission was granted to us with a recommendation to run a phase 4 clinical trial, which we actually did. And that bringing that in India was really a turning point for us because suddenly we realized it was not just one hospital in Mumbai. There were a number of hospitals in Delhi, hospitals in other parts of the country, which were seeing these bugs and did not really have anything else. So I think understanding really what's the kind of bugs that are there in your country, and you know that these bugs could spread to neighboring countries or even across oceans, is something that that is very, very important. So I think that's the first fundamental thing, is to really understand, find out from microbiology labs, or there are formal surveillance programs going on to really see what's going on. So that's certainly one approach. The way we would look at success is, do we really see the usage of the drug in the right patient population in the right way, and not simply look at how much really does the product sell, right? While most companies will certainly use that as a tool for a lot of their successful products, I think for anti-infectives, there should be an equally important marker of are they being used in the right patient population? So we have seen now colistin over the last 15 years in India that many hospitals, having drawn up antibiograms, having realized that if colistin doesn't work, then we are in really deep trouble. It's almost like the final frontier for anti-infectives. So hospitals now drawing up antibiograms, classifying how antibiotics should be used in, let's say, the gram-negative infections is a bigger problem that we have here, and then trying to come up with some solutions. But I have to say that we also are seeing more and more reports of colistin resistance also. And like the WHO has a list of priority pathogens, the Indian Council of Medical Research, along with the WHO South Asia office, also released its own list of priority pathogens. And you'll see a few differences. And one of the priority pathogens that comes out and hits you is actually colistin-resistant organisms. So this is the other word. So I'm unable to say, Anthony, how I define success. But I think a success is the fact that first and foremost, the drug is actually available in that country which needs it. And then second, of course, is the right patient population actually uses it. I do recall that we were involved in running a PK study in patients in the intensive care to really understand the dosing that was recommended in the package insert of the old times. Is it appropriate? And we were able to demonstrate that for some bugs like Pseudomonas, the dosing wasn't the right dosing. We probably needed higher dose. Simultaneously, I remember in Europe or in the UK, I don't often recall, data was coming up about loading doses of colistin. So we went from 1 to 2 million units 3 times a day to now a label dosing as 9 million units loading dose and 4.5 million units twice a day. So it's remarkable. I think this holds. So it's a big lesson on what we have learned on colistin, that you introduce it, old drug, you have to repeat some interesting studies to really know what should be the right dosing, right? And I think you're seeing similar situations somewhat with compounds like fosfomycin, which are old drugs, which have also been more recently introduced. So I'll just stop there. Sorry if I've been too long in my answer.
No, not at all. That was really useful, and I am looking forward to coming back on some of the on some of the regulatory questions that you raised and other issues later. But before we do, finally, Jennifer, GARDP has been doing a lot of work on the best model for selling antibiotics. And what has this looked like? And what future system for distributing antibiotics would you like to see?
Thanks, Anthony. This is a really great question. So, in some ways, an improved future system would involve a whole lot more data than what we have now. So that goes from better evidence on how to use antibiotics, as Jaideep was actually just commenting on, to better knowledge of demand and market trends. And it would also involve a coordinated network of actors, similar to what Fatima was saying earlier, to better support an efficient market for antibiotics, especially in low and middle income countries. So first, let me just talk a little bit about clinical evidence. So I think innovative trial designs like platform trials or practical trial designs that help us to find more optimal antibiotics and regimens can help us find the evidence on how to use treatments optimally in specific contexts, in kind of the real world, in the real patients that we're facing, not in a way in kind of the more selected groups that often get enrolled in kind of more typical registrational trial designs. And that kind of evidence can help regions build strong and harmonized guidelines that will in turn help to organize the market for antibiotics. Evidence from also improved clinical surveillance and local antibiograms, scraping the data we may already have and using it better, will also help us build better forecasts, providing both clinicians, programs, and suppliers with better information. So now second, I think use of pooled purchasing methods, and not just pooled procurement, but ranging from pooled forecasting to order alignment to more of kind of the all-in pooled procurement we might think of, can also help us consolidate demand and provide confidence and efficiencies to suppliers. Countries can work either separately or together to support a pooled stockpile of a basket of essential antibiotics that may be at risk of shortages. So forecasting, market information, and kind of some sort of storm wall, like a stockpile, a rotating stockpile, can also help us to smooth out the market, both for new product introduction, but also to help buffer against either supply reduction or unexpected demand increase that often leads to shortages of even older antibiotics. And third, innovative payment models like the one being piloted by Sweden, which provides kind of a partially delinked model where a fixed payment is used to guarantee a certain volume of antibiotics, can also be really interesting, I think, to help stabilize the market, including for older antibiotics, providing that certainty, providing financial support even for these older antibiotics where the margins are smaller. And it may even help incentivize registration and access both for old and newer antibiotics. And finally, voluntary licensing, I think, is a really important tool. It's been used in other health areas like HIV, like hepatitis C, and it can also be used in antimicrobial resistance to improve access to patented antibiotics. So just one example, GARD-P recently signed an agreement between Shionogi, the originator of cefiderocol, which is a antibiotic that's US FDA and EMA approved. It's on the essential medicines list that Benedict talked about earlier. And it's really for very much kind of a last line antibiotic used for positioned for certain carbapenem resistant infections. And this kind of voluntary license in a way is a first of its kind, a public health oriented license for between an originator and a nonprofit for an antibiotic for AMR. And it can serve as a pathfinder to help accelerate access to affordable novel antibiotics in low and middle income countries. So I actually think there's a lot of really interesting ideas, a lot of movement, including on regional pooling, regional regulatory harmonization and reliance, as well as a move into voluntary licensing for novel antibiotics and innovative payment models. So I think there's a lot of really interesting opportunity that we can leverage and learn from right now to improve market systems and payment models for novel and old antibiotics. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Jennifer, and thanks indeed to everyone for your useful contributions. As you can see, we've got a diverse panel with lots of different expertise around the areas of access. And if you do have any questions for them, please do put it in the chat box. But I will start by using the chair's prerogative and asking one or two questions of my own. A theme that came up in several of the questions was the issue of registration. Fatima, you talked about how companies don't have access plans for most antibiotics. And part of the difficulty of that is that you have to do different things to register the same drug in different parts of the world, as both Jennifer and Jaideep mentioned. So do we need to do more to harmonize regulations for registering drugs? And what do you think that looks like? Maybe I'll start with you, Fatima.
Sure, of course. So registration is important for both off-patent and on-patent medicines, where it can take years for regulatory bodies to actually approve a product. So what does this look like? Favorable conditions for companies to register provide for swifter access. And so by reducing the need for companies to gather and submit different data sets for each country in which they want to introduce their products, local regulatory bodies can align the registration process between countries in the same region. An example of this is the South African Health Product Regulatory Authority, who have streamlined their registration process from approximately 6 years to 2 years. And so by being able to harmonize, it'll make registration easy and more likely also be able to support procurement to increase purchasing power and stabilize demand.
Great, thank you very much for that. And Jaideep, what has been your experience on different regulations?
So I think the regulations obviously are quite different in different countries. So for example, in some countries such as India, an antibiotic which has been approved by the FDA or the EMA needs to undergo phase 3 clinical trials for approval. One can ask for a waiver depending on the high unmet medical need, the availability of data, microbiological data, etc. one can get a waiver, but it does not always happen. So I do believe that for antibiotics, although I think a lot of us have been talking about anti-infectives a lot over the last several years, I think the regulatory agencies, the experts, the people doing the surveillance need to come together to understand this is a common problem and provide probably a faster route for getting some of the new antibiotics to countries. Out of the 15 or 16 new antibiotics that have been discovered and launched in the last 5 to 7 years, if you look at the numbers that have actually come into those 1 million countries, it's actually between 0 and 2. So we still have 90% of the new antibiotics that have been launched in the US or Europe, where the number of patients who need them is actually small. Most of them are not available in this part of the world. That is the LMICs, which perhaps have a greater need of them. So I often see this as a situation akin to what was HIV about 20 years ago. Countries which have the highest burden of the disease have the lowest access of the new drugs, and to some extent also the old generic medicine. So we are in a very strange situation, and I think this is where whether it is regulatory authorities coming together of multiple countries to provide access, they working with the local surveillance and the government policymakers to make sure that these antibiotics actually come into those countries, and of course accompanied by proper education to make sure that there is appropriate use. I think if this all can come together, and I think all of us should really probably vote for that or lobby for that, perhaps we will have better access, faster regulatory requirements, maybe mandate some microbiological studies, not necessarily always clinical studies, for the next 3 years to make sure to study the pattern of resistance that is changing. So as you know, the FDA, for example, mandates 5 years of surveillance of a new antibiotic once it is approved. And one can bring in such kind of regulations to help companies bring antibiotics early into some countries.
Great, thank you very much for that. And just a quick follow-up from me, Jaideep. You mentioned earlier that in India, you got a waiver on colistin before running a phase 4 trial. Are waivers a way around differing local registration, or do we need to harmonize all the rules?
So India has this clause, I think, in the New Drugs and Clinical Trials Act of 2019. Of course, it is exercised at a very low frequency. I can well understand that because it's part of the regulatory process. So if there is a clear unmet medical need by the experts, by the policymakers, and as I said, we're just getting more data about the resistance patterns in our country. As I mentioned, the ICMR recently published priority pathogens from India as well, which was not the same necessarily as what the WHO has done. In fact, it's a little add-on. I think there can be opportunity for actually granting waivers with certain post-marketing commitments. So that's, I think, something that we can do. South Africa, I think, very well mentioned earlier that from 6 years, it's branched onto 2 years. So in South Africa, you don't really need any additional clinical trials. If you're able to submit a dossier which is FDA or EMA compliant, then you don't really need to submit any additional data in South Africa, provided you know the resistance patterns of the bugs and that it's actually important to introduce that drug. So I think as a company where we are looking at all this, we are also trying to figure out which antibiotics and going to which country, how long will that take, and what's the dossier like for that. And may I add one more thing? I don't know if you're going to cover it later, Anthony, but a lot of the raw materials and the APIs for these antibiotics, especially if they are beta-lactams, are not easily manufactured by many companies. Synthetic ones like fluoroquinolones, for example, very commonly done. But if you start looking at beta-lactams or beta-lactamase inhibitors in combination, it's a little more challenging. You have very few companies making the APIs. You have very few companies having the facility of the finished formulation to make it, because there are strict guidelines on where you can make beta-lactams, where you can make carbapenems, etc., and to get all this approved by the regulatory authorities. So I think it's a lot more complex than what it is. And as you probably know, 2 out of 3 antibiotics used in the world are actually beta-lactams.
Great. Thank you very much for that follow-up response. Jennifer, how do you think we can harmonize and improve regulation?
Great. So, thinking about kind of the HIV experience that Jaideep brought up earlier, there was a huge kind of revolution when the WHO pre-qualification program came in. It really allowed for quality to be assured, for countries to help participate in the collaborative registration procedure. So I think this was really important. I think for certain medications, for certain antibiotics on the essential medicines list, this program will continue to be important. However, I think we also have to recognize that we in antibiotics don't have a PEPFAR or global fund requiring WHO PQ. So there may be less of a necessity or incentive for companies to go that route. However, I think in contrast, again, there may be a regional regulatory harmonization or reliance approach, relying again on a WHO initiative to benchmark certain national regulatory authorities as more stringent as being more stringent in terms of their review of dossiers. And I think this is, again, could be a hugely influential and revolutionary thing that the WHO is leading on. If there are national regulatory authorities that can really be relied upon in terms of their ability to review dossiers, including novel chemical entities, then there may be a kind of a pathway set up to do regional hubs for regulatory review on which reliance for other national regulatory authorities can rely, especially in terms of the quality of that review. So I think that that's a really important thing. And then the only other thing I would say is that, I think we should, as a community, really challenge ourselves to say, can we get the time between when a new product, an important new product that potentially is on the EML or going to be on the EML, can we get the timeline from when that product is registered in a high-income country, that first registration, to when it's registered in kind of higher burden, low-income countries to be less than 5 years? I think we need to have some of these targets that we are measuring our progress against. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. And I completely agree. Measurable targets, I think, is the way forward for lots of this stuff. Well, you talked a lot about the World Health Organization, Jennifer, so it seems like an appropriate time to bring on our World Health Organization panelists. Benedict, what do you think about harmonizing regulation?
I wanted to make a comment about having access to all kinds of antibiotics. And I think the key issue is that we need to be selective, right? It's not that any new antibiotic needs to be available everywhere, because not all really may meet the requirements to be essential. They need to have the characteristics that they're really safe, effective, and essential to treat multi-drug resistant infections. And there we also have a problem, because a lot of the approval trials that have been done and on which the approval have been granted in the US and in Europe are actually done in patients without multi-drug resistant infections. So we are a bit in a situation where we have all these last resort antibiotics approved, but their main clinical use is actually for indications where they have not been well studied. So I think there is clearly also a need to generate better evidence, even once they have been approved, how they perform in infections with multi-drug resistant organs. And this is also true for some of the older antibiotics, because the data for some of them are also not very good. So I think harmonization of regulation is certainly important, but we need to be selective which antibiotics need to be available, and we need to make sure that we have the right evidence also to decide which are the antibiotics worth having and how should they be used. Because based on the evidence we have right now, we have to be quite sincere that for many of the new antibiotics, we actually do not know it. Regarding pre-qualification, I include it's very important. You know that WHO publishes a call for expression of interest, and this is always based on disease areas. And actually, for antibiotics right now, it's pediatric infections, I think, mostly, and childhood pneumonia. So there are also gaps there. I think it's an important issue, but it's clear that it's a call for expression of interest, then there needs to be also reaction by the pharmaceutical industry to apply, because for some of these medicines, the calls have been open quite a long time and there has been relatively little interest. So that can't be the only solution. Over.
Great, thank you very much for that. And I'm glad to see there are questions coming in. I'm going to do one more question, hopefully quite quickly, and then we'll come to questions from the audience. And if you're sitting there with a question to ask, please do ask it and we'll try and get to you. But firstly, several of you have talked about the different partnerships and groups working together. And I wanted to ask, what is the value of innovative partnerships to overcome market hurdles around antimicrobial resistance? Fatima, do you want to get us going?
Sure, of course. So partnerships allow for communication and clarity and this use of each partner's strengths. So the value of partnerships when a company partners with governments or health organizations allows insights into need and demand. It allows them to team up locally or regionally for implementation. It allows for the sharing of burden of costs and tasks in production and delivery of supplies, supports each other to streamline process and procedure, including registration, to make medicines more available, and it can also strengthen health systems. So through partnerships, this can prompt also companies to strengthen their supply chains when the demand is clear, so that companies can commit to meeting a demand with uninterrupted supply of high quality and safe products. And so through partnerships, they can also team up to procure essential antibiotics or fund and implement through access programs. And so partnerships do allow for a wide range of activities that wouldn't normally be able if it was done unilaterally.
Great, thank you very much. And Jaideep, what are your views on partnerships?
So I think this is an area where partnerships are needed perhaps than in any other area, because you're working right from understanding the nature of the bug in a particular country or a region to looking at existing anti-infectives and their manufacturing back to the raw materials and everything. You also need to understand what is the demand. You also need to understand the regulatory process for it. You also need to follow up on that. Doesn't mean that once a drug is introduced, it's going to the demand is going to remain forever. It may go up or it may dramatically go down in 5 years, depending on what happens. So I think this is an area where you need partnerships, never other. And I don't think we should go back later than COVID. Look what COVID has done. As a company, Cipla partnered with about half a dozen big pharma companies to bring in various COVID drugs. Also worked with local companies in India to bring diagnostics, which Cipla has never done. Right? It was essentially, I think COVID really brought in some very unique partnerships. And why shouldn't this be extended to antibiotics? And I think we have to all think and move in that direction.
Great, thank you very much for that. Jennifer, GARDP seems to do innumerable partnerships with the World Health Organization and Shinoki, as you mentioned, and the Clinton Global Health Initiative and UNICEF, and including even research partnerships with the Center for Global Development. So what do you think we need in terms of innovative partnerships to overcome these market hurdles?
Yeah. Thanks. So GARDP, partnership is in our name, that's the P. Just as Jaideep was just saying, I think that we need to build this ecosystem for access to an appropriate use of the right antibiotics. And, you know, as Fatima laid out in her introductory remarks, there are really a number of these key barriers, again, both for access to old and new antibiotics that can be helped by partnerships. Fragmented markets. We can partner for pooling forecasts, for pooling procurement, for making sure that there is the information. This dearth of information, partnering to bring together different information sources to complement each other. Lack of really market responsiveness. We need to make sure that each partner is really pulling their weight. And so in a way, I think that one of the innovative things I think about this market ecosystem for antibiotic resistance and for better access to antibacterials is that we need to figure out not only what we as each partner can provide. So GARDP, we can help provide some of the development, some of the evidence, some of the voluntary licensing and work in partnership to think about appropriate introduction. But we absolutely need other partners to come and meet us halfway. So we need originators to come and work with us on developing products to make sure that, evidence is actually robust, not just for regulatory approval, but for actual use. We need manufacturers like Cipla and others to work with us to make sure that the products are affordable, quality, and available. We need both WHO PQ, but also some of the national regulatory authorities to work to help to rapidly evaluate these dossiers and streamline their approval, as well as to make sure that they are utilizing the regional reliance or harmonization pathways that can really help reduce that barrier. So I think that there's, again, a lot of efficiencies that we can squeeze out of this ecosystem, but it really will rely on us working together.
Great, I completely agree. Finally, Benedict, what do you think the role of innovative partnerships are in antimicrobial resistance?
Obviously, it goes without saying, right, that partnership is important, but I think we also need to realize that the interests may not always be aligned, and I think we need to be transparent about this. Pharmaceutical industry are not philanthropic organizations, right? The ultimate aim is also to gain money. I think in COVID, we saw some of the successes, but we also saw some of the failures of collaborations with international organizations and the pharmaceutical industry. So I think collaboration is important. I don't think we can expect always miracles, because I think these different viewpoints are there, and it's unrealistic to assume that we all have entirely aligned interests. But I think it's important. I just wanted to mention still, because I forgot it before, about the new antibiotics, right? If you look at the resistant mechanisms, we have now a lot of quite a few antibiotics active against carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterialis. But if you talk about the type of resistance that's most prevalent in many settings, like in India, the NDM1 metallobeta-lactamases, there we have actually very few options. So we have many antibiotics, but they're actually not so useful in the settings that's most prevalent. And for example, the populations, if you look at neonatal sepsis, neonatal infections, and that's an area where GARDP is working in, some of these new antibiotics haven't even been tested in the pediatric population in the neonatal. And that is the population that would potentially have among the largest benefits. So I think there's a lot that's, WHO can work also with industry. The priority pathogen list, I think, is a good example of where WHO can try to show where some of the priorities should be. But it's obviously not an easy task. It's important to talk to each other and to be transparent about the different aims. Over.
I completely agree. So first of all, let me thank the three people who've written in questions. If anyone else has a question, please do share. The three questions were quite similar, so I'm going to try and combine them. They all asked about different versions of supply chain diversification and capacity building. And should we be looking to have more local manufacturing of antibiotics, as well as the role of pharmaceutical industry in achieving this? So, Fatima, firstly to you, what do you think the role should be of supply chain diversification of antimicrobials?
Great. So just to step back, local manufacturing, technology transfer, diversification of the supply chain, these are strategies that are an important step towards sustainability. So it improves access to a company's products while decreasing a region's dependency on international supply chain and reduces the risk of shortages and stockouts. So in our 2021 benchmark, we found that out of the 17 companies we assessed, 10 of those companies do support local manufacturing projects across 14 low and middle income countries. But it really depends on the presence of local partners with the right skills and quality standards. And so that's the complexity here, is finding suitable manufacturers to produce quality products in low and middle income countries. And since most low and middle income countries have smaller populations and lower demand for on-patent products, Rather than serving one country with one local manufacturing plant, building regional manufacturing hubs could be a solution to serve several countries that have a greater potential to meet that threshold of viability and expand limited manufacturing capacity, and to make it financially sustainable in underserved regions.
Great, thank you very much for that. Jaideep, what do you think the role is for the diversification of manufacturing, or is this an important thing that we should be considering?
So I think one of the key points here is actually the manufacturing of the API. As I mentioned earlier, 2 out of 3 antibiotics used in the world are actually beta-lactams. And there are very, very few manufacturers of beta-lactams or beta-lactamase inhibitors in the world, especially if you want to talk about a certain grade or a certain quality. So India, for example, the Indian government last year launched a production-linked incentive scheme for manufacturers to come up with ideas about what they would like to produce in India, rather than be dependent on other countries for the raw materials. Several companies have submitted proposals, and I do know that there have been several cases of successes where a couple of companies have actually put in proposals for manufacturing penicillins or other beta-lactams in India right from the APIs. And I think that will become important, because if APIs of these are actually made in India completely from the basic stage, that will help in diversifying supply chains, reducing the reliability on a particular country or a particular supplier. Because if there is any minor disruption, leave aside COVID pandemic, at a plant due to a simple accident or a fire, everything can go for a toss. I just read 2 days ago that oral amoxicillin powder was in short supply in the US. And the FDA released guidelines on how you can be compounding amoxicillin in your hospital when you want to. I mean, I was taken aback. So I hope it's amoxicillin powder and not other, but I do recall reading this 2 days ago. So even in the highest income countries, basic antibiotic availability can go for a toss. And I think it's super critical how we can diversify supply chains. Formulation is different than from API, and therefore when you look at local manufacturing, you have to look at 2 things. I think API manufacturing is far more complex. There are hazardous reactions when you make these APIs, etc. Formulation manufacturing is somewhat less complex. I wouldn't say it's not, it's less. But then as I think was pointed out earlier, when you look at local manufacturing, it's got to have the local skills, availability of land, water, electricity, all the other things have to be available. It's not just one particular thing.
Great, thank you very much. Benedict.
Yeah, I think everybody agrees that there needs to be a more resilient system, assuring that antibiotics are available even if there's a fire in one company, like happened a few years ago for piperacin tazobactam, that then resulted in a worldwide shortage. That is evident. I think like with everything, we need to consider potentially unintended consequences. I think if you have a lot of local manufacturing, it may be the wrong antibiotics that also manufactures. If you have a lot of local production of watch antibiotics that are potentially financially more interesting also to produce, then you may have the unintended consequences of actually favoring use of watch antibiotics rather than access antibiotics. Because there may be some element of also then protectionism of the local production, etc. So I think these are all very, very complex problems that don't have simple solutions, and we have to keep in mind potential unintended consequences. But some diversification and more resilience of the supply chain is certainly needed. Over.
Great, thank you very much. So we're starting to come to the end of our hour, sadly. I think most of the main points have been made here, so I'm going to move on to the next question. And also, if the panelists have any broader reflections, please do share them next. I'm not sure we'll have a chance to come back to you each again. But Rachel asks, says that the point about different organizations and sectors being driven by different interests and needs is a great one. And how much do we think this has affected previous and existing collaborations? And looking forward, can we instead focus on the common goals that different stakeholders have as a way of bringing sectors together? Jennifer, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And again, I think we saw the fallout of this happen in COVID. We thought we could kind of get everyone together under COVAX and, there would be allocation of supply, and that absolutely did not happen. So I think we have to kind of come through that and realize there are benefits to having some regional strength. And we also have to make sure that we are, as much as possible, aligning incentives, especially financial incentives, so that we are kind of all going towards the same goal, and recognize that in many cases we are dealing with the private sector where there is a major concern about the bottom line, and that is just the fact in many cases. But I also think that there are probably ways that we can put into effect policies and even trade treaties that can help to improve allocation and access to these essential medicines that Benedict was speaking about. So I think that there are a number of tools. We should take the lessons learned from COVID and but also some of the positive lessons learned from other disease areas in the past, and move forward and recognize that we have to figure out a way to make the market more attractive for consistent supply. That may be through efficiencies like better market intelligence, pooling, et cetera, order alignment. Some of it may be through some of the financial instruments like the Sweden model. And some of it we may need to regulate better with either public sector production or some additional policies and trade treaties.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer. Benedict, it was your original point about different groups having different incentives or needs. I wonder how you see them playing against each other, and is there a way to kind of get the best out of everyone?
I wish I had a miracle solution. I think the most important thing is to be as transparent as possible. It's not something that's limited to antibiotics. I would even say that in the area of non-communicable diseases, it's probably even a larger problem. Many pharmaceutical industries have their own access programs. There's a certain lack of transparency. It's unclear how these programs are then sustainable, etc. There's a lot that needs to be identified. Where WHO probably has also a role to establish what are the minimum requirements that should be given. Not that it ends up that creating a market monopoly and then having the patients pay the price in the healthcare system. So I think it's a complicated issue, and there are no easy solutions. But I think WHO is aware of that, and lots of intelligent people are thinking about solutions to it. But it's certainly not a quick, easy process to resolve. Over.
So maybe I can just make a slightly separate comment on this. So when we look at antibiotics as a class of drugs, we generally look at, if you look at most of the ones like broad spectrum antibiotics, a lot of which could be used, quote unquote, a little empirically in the hospital setting, where you have a lot of infections which may be resistant. But maybe it's also equally important to change the understanding a little and look at not just broad spectrum, but equally important to look at narrow spectrum antibiotics, or what we call more targeted treatments. Of course, provided we know the bug that is actually causing the infection, or at least we suspect that this is likely to be the bug in the local milieu of a particular hospital. And I think we should give probably sufficient importance even to that as a strategy, because if you can use a narrow spectrum antibiotic with the same success as a broad spectrum, I guess one would go for the narrow spectrum antibiotic. And that's not easy, because you need physicians to be educated. The old de-escalation concept that we had, that you start with 2 drugs or 3 drugs, and then once you know the bug, then you switch to 1 drug. Easier said than done. But this is an element I think worth thinking about as the way ahead for when we think about antibiotics.
Great, thank you very much for that. We only have 1 minute left, so I am sadly going to have to cut the conversation short. But it seems like there's a lot of agreement on this. Areas around local manufacturing are seen as key in diversifying supply chains where it's possible. think all of our panelists agree that we need to do more to harmonize regulation and make it easier to register drugs in countries, but also do more to incentivize companies to register or create partnerships such as the one being pushed forward by GARD-P so that the products make it to the people who need them. And working together is a really important part of dealing with antimicrobial resistance. Because as we've all agreed, access is essential, and we should both get access to people so that we protect drugs, but also because it is important for its own right. We live in a world where very cheap medicine can save lots of lives, and people don't have access to that. So this Antibiotic Awareness Week, maybe we should all be thinking about how we overcome that problem. I'd like to close by saying thank you to our 4 panelists, Fatima, Jennifer, Benedict, and Jadip, as well as thank you to the Access to Medicines Foundation and Camille and others for facilitating and organizing this event. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.